afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to Other Minds and Hands. This is episode 105, and I am joined as always by Maggie Parke, and we are ready to continue our discussion, our planning session for episode 1 of our little pilot project for Pride and Prejudice.
Yeah, so we've talked about this before, but it's going to take a couple of these kind of sessions where we talk through what we want to do. Because frankly, finding time that Corey and I are able to talk about planning things is just impossible. So we're using this time. But I hope it's fun for you guys to watch too, because it's not yet. I think we've just been kind of musing. But I feel like this episode we should start getting into an actual development procedure and talking through how we want to proceed, main points we want to hit. You know, I always like to think about flow. How are we going to introduce information? How are we going to prepare them with our agenda for the episode? And then we actually start scripting it. So we're not going to do a full script, right? We're just going to do
outlines.
Points.
Yeah.
But if we can start to think about what we want the structure of episode 1 to actually look like, then that is where we're going to aim.
Yes.
That's the goal of tonight, is to outline that and maybe get so far as writing up the bullet points. And then there might probably still be one session where we actually give it a dry run and talk through how it works the same way you would rehearse a presentation, in front of a class or something. That's what we would aim to do. Work out all the glitches, and then we'd have a session where we just record it. And it's so good that we get it on the first time with no issues, and we hardly have to edit.
Yeah, I'm sure that's just exactly how it'll go down.
Yeah. One shot Olsen, right?
That's it.
Yeah. So, how do we want to proceed? I think we need to look at the sections of the book first.
So, our first one, the first episode that we were discussing last time was the opening sequence up through and including the initial ball, the initial meeting of Elizabeth and Darcy, right? Right. So we want to think about how we want to shape that discussion, essentially. Right. So that we can, so that we can cover what we want to cover, but it's going to be, as always, the balance is challenging because there is so much that can be done in direct analysis and discussion of the text, direct analysis of the films themselves, just independently of themselves, what they're doing in their storytelling, and then in the comparison back and forth and to the book, there's so much to be done, and we really have to kind of pick and choose. I'm trying not to put too much pressure on myself as far as picking and choosing in ways that are going to be perfect for every episode of the whole thing, because it could change. So I'm trying to, my thought is just, we focus just specifically on this first one. So do we want to start with a kind of groundwork from the book, with book analysis only to be? We've done that before in our discussions, right? We'll just start here's the book and here's what goes on here, before we then shift to the films in order to have that book context in the background, even for what is the first thing we see in these films.
It's not useless to do an adaptation discussion without knowing the text, but if you want to do deep analysis, the whole point is to compare it to the original source material. So it's interesting to talk about film adaptations because it's fun to talk about movies.
Right.
But in terms of analysis, it doesn't really mean anything unless you have a clear understanding of the core text.
Right.
So I think, yes, definitely. The other thing I was thinking about before we started was, the same thing we were doing with exploring Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Corey and I went straight into analysis of minute 1 of the film. And we were like, oh, wait, we need an introduction.
Yes.
So I think this is classic us. I think we might have 2 episodes here.
Right.
Because I feel like episode 1 could be introduction to our instruction, like we're talking about, this is what we're aiming to do with this series. really quick on why we're doing it this way, what we hope to accomplish with this kind of deep analysis.
Yes.
And then maybe the second half of that first episode is just the textual analysis. Episode 1 is introduction, stating what our plan is, and text. And then episode 2, we start comparing scenes.
Okay.
What do you think?
Yeah. So, well, one thing that feels a little bit awkward about that is if we do the text introduction to the scenes we're going to talk about in the film in episode 2, then it's weird to like have separated things that way one time, and then next episode, right, will be, because obviously it's not like we're going to talk about like the entire book, right? Like, let's talk about the entire book. Now, I mean, one thing that I think is really important, and when I think about what to cover in a book analysis, the main thing I would want to emphasize, and much more so than I normally would if I were just leading a discussion on the book itself. I mean, I probably would talk about this because, especially through our discussions, I've become interested in this question. But the question, which is clearly important when thinking about adaptations, is not just what does Jane Austen do, like what is the story, what are the characters, what happens, but how does Jane Austen go about doing it, right? How does the book what does the book convey, and how does it go about conveying it? And that seems to me, in setting up what we're going to want to talk about in the adaptations, it's a much more important question. It's a kind of a curiosity normally, right? I mean, like if you're reading a Jane Austen novel and you are following the way, the intricate connections of the plot, like how one scene plays off previous scenes and sets up others. If you're, following these particular themes, if you're, perceiving the kind of nuances of character that she's developing, you're doing great. Like that's that's where my focus would be if it was just like a Jane Austen book discussion. And any time that you spent noticing, did you notice how she did that? Like, did you notice how she conveyed how she drew our attention to this one thing about this one character? That would be kind of a curiosity, but it would be unlikely. Normally, again, in the way I would normally discussing, it would be unlikely to be the focus. But here, it clearly is an important focus, I think, because that's exactly, it's when we're looking at the adaptations, it's exactly trying to understand what kind of challenges they have and how they need to do things in film, and how that's different from how she does things in the book. That is going to be really important for us to understand, to really be able to contextualize some of the adaptation decisions that are being made.
I love this. I'm just thinking structure now. So if episode 1's introduction and why are we doing it the way we're doing it, a little bit of background on Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice, great, that's episode 1. Episode 2, I mean, we kind of have to get into a little bit of a system. So it's like first half hour is deep text analysis. Second half hour is the BBC, and the third half hour. I mean, that makes really natural sense, and that would give us something to follow going forward pretty easily. We're going to have to be really selective, aren't we? Because half an hour of deep textual analysis
goes by fast.
Yeah.
Yes.
But that means that we pick a few like really key examples and assume that our audience is very familiar with the text itself. We're not going to read the book to you and summarize it.
No, it's such a critical, it's such a critical, most people have no idea in practice how much longer it takes to really discuss something than it does to read it or perform it, right? I mean, many times in my career, I've heard people laugh about how like, oh, we're going to take like 4 hours discussing, 8 lines of poetry or something like that. And it's like, dude, that is a minimum, right? I mean, like it's, and the thing is, like, it's not just some peculiarity of me and my approach. This is true of anything. Like take anything, I'll use 2 like very different kind of, but like physical examples. Imagine a figure skating routine, right? And something that takes the figure skater 1 second to do, like one move that takes less than 1 second of time, right? And if you're trying to explain like what it was that she did, what made that amazing, like what it is in her technique that made that move particularly successful compared to other, techniques that she does, or compared to other people who have tried that technique and don't do it as well. I mean, to try to explain that 1 second of motion is going to take, you could easily take an hour discussing that 1 second of motion. Or similarly, for other kinds of physical activities fans, imagine how much time you could spend if you were trying to break down one single snap of American football, right? You've got 22 people all doing different things. You've got the play call on the one side and the play call on the other side, and then how the play unfolds. You could easily spend more than an hour if you tried to understand, like in full, what was happening. And the thing might have taken 5 seconds, right? Anytime you are trying to really break down and understand something, it requires massive, massive expansion of the thing. And so what this means is, like, not only in half an hour, not only can we not do a scene, like we have to cherry pick, very carefully cherry pick a few elements. Like, for instance, the little conversation, the little spontaneous discussion that we had of the fascinating adaptation choice to have the opening scene of the BBC Pride and Prejudice be Bingley and Darcy on their horses looking at Netherfield, which is not in the text, right? I mean, presumably did happen in the story, but it's not described in the text. That alone, like, that's easy, a 10-15 minute discussion. And we haven't even gotten to, like, the actual, in a sense, actual opening scene, like the real opening sequence of the story yet. That's like the credits, opening shot.
Well, also, if we're thinking of this as kind of like more of a concept, I mean, we're thinking of this as a slightly tighter mini series of scraping the surface of a deep dive, right? Like, if this is kind of an example of that, then I think that probably is going to be our challenge, that we can do this, but we're only going to pick 1 or 2 points per section.
Yeah, we're going to have to be really selective. Yeah.
Yeah.
And therefore we're going to want to be picking in ways that are going to really bring out interesting stuff. Right.
Yes.
We can't make any, we have to. So, like, and this is, by the way, this is mostly self-talk. Like, I always have to do this to myself, right? Is to remind myself that there can be no attempt to try to be, like, thorough, or, to try to discuss even the whole scene, right? Or even the whole episode. That is the episode in the story. I mean, there has to be a willingness to say, we are going to pick this element because it's characteristic and shows us some interesting things, right? And gives us some interesting things to compare. And that's going to have to be enough, right, in order to sort of show what's going on here. So that selectiveness, I think, is, and so therefore choosing our bits, right, is going to have to be important. Now, Karen has an excellent question on YouTube. She says, will the introductory episode look at how the adaptations do world building? That, like, in theory, this world that we're seeing in Jane Austen's world is as alien to us as Arrakis or Numenor, right? Like, so what do we learn from how they do? And as I said last time, this is also tricky because Jane Austen doesn't do it. She doesn't do it nearly as much, at least, because she's writing about her contemporary world. She's making assumptions that her readers will understand the parameters of her world in ways that modern readers just don't. So this is an additional challenge that the adaptations have, that world is alien to us. And I do think that that's worth acknowledging. And that's a kind of thing that might be a good topic for the prologue episode.
Yeah, I was just trying to sketch some of that stuff out. Like, it would start with just introducing ourselves, what we're doing. This is what we're doing in this series. Yeah. This is why we're doing it this way. In each episode, earache. In each episode, ...
Yeah.
Or we plan to ...
Yeah.
And then I do think we kind of have to give a primer.
Yeah, some general context and explanation of the kind of thing that we're doing, essentially.
General context, background, and expectations. So we should set expectations of, we're not going to give summary. We assume you know the text. We are deep diving into this. At the top of each episode, we'll give you the points that we're looking into for that episode.
Yeah. 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 By the way, Phil is really enjoying your portmanteau word in number 1 in the next section. Our illustration.
Our illustration.
That's
We
good.
came up with that last time, I think.
It's nice.
Yeah.
I like it. It's not an illustration. It's not an instruction.
It's like both. I was trying to explain to somebody what we were trying to do, and I was like, I don't know. It's kind of like a class meets a TED Talk, but it's neither of those.
Yeah.
I like illustration.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Illustration. I like it. Yeah. So. So I'm thinking, like, again, for the latter half of the, for the latter portion of this primer episode, I'm thinking of basically kind of laying some groundworks, describing like what and context, stuff that we're not going to want to have to say every time, right? So for instance, coming back for just a moment to the thing I was complaining about last time, about the Keira Knightley film, that, like when she throws stuff right in Darcy's face in that really, like, not only bold but rude way, like, which seems so unlike how Elizabeth Bennet would act, and so not in keeping with the society that Austen describes, the social environment that Austen describes. There's context to that, as we were discussing last time. Like, this is not a film. This is a film about, the Regency period, but it's not a film for the Regency period. It is a film for modern audience to, like, mediate the Regency period to modern audiences. And there are different ways you can do that and different choices that you can make. But the choices that they make do have to be understood in that context. And this isn't just like, sometimes I feel like people talk about this like it's just a matter of cutting people slack. Like, oh yeah, I know you've got to, like, cater to the least common denominator or something like that. So, like, but sometimes when people talk about that, it sounds like it's just lowering expectations, right? Yeah. But this isn't just about lowering expectations. It's about understanding what the film is trying to achieve. It's about understanding what it is setting about to do, and what it is setting about to do, what seems clear from the Keira Knightley one from the beginning, is that it is not merely trying to represent, it's not just giving us a little window into what the Regency, a Regency ball would have looked like.
Right.
In some ways it kind of seems like that, and in some ways they're doing that, but they're not just doing that. And so some discussion about that in the context, exactly, I think, as Karen was thinking about it in like a world building kind of sense. Like, there are ways in which they are trying to communicate and set things up, but they're also differentiating. Like, it's the world building that's involved is not just like, okay, so let us introduce you to what the Regency period was like in England. Like, there's some of that. But there's also, like, we're trying to introduce you to, like, the Regency, the fictional version of the Regency period that we're depicting in this story. And because sometimes adaptations will make systematic, like, for a period drama like this, they'll make systematic ahistorical decisions on purpose.
Yeah.
It might be like a matter of costume, for instance. They might decide, like, yeah, this is how they would have done those dresses in the Regency period, but we're going to do it differently because we don't like that look, for some reason.
They've done it in architecture purely to access camera angles that they're not able to access normally. Like, the rooms were too small in Regency homes. We need to be able to get a wide shot of this room.
Yes.
So there are not walls here.
Yeah. Do you know how much it costs to heat a room in, like, the 18th century with, like, 10-foot ceilings? So yeah, those rooms would have had like 8-foot ceilings or 7.5-foot ceilings, even 7-foot ceilings. I mean, this was, I just recently, my my wife and I just went to Salem, Massachusetts, and toured the House of Seven Gables in Salem. And, you know, speaking of like 19th century novels, this one American, of course, Hawthorne. And I mean, I didn't just hit my head on the doorways. I did duck under the. I'm 6 feet tall. I'm not like hugely tall, but I'm not short either. And I had to duck under the and seriously, the stairs. I practically had to like walk on all fours up the stairs because like I kept hitting my head. So anyway, so yeah, like there are lots of ways.
You could not film in that.
You could not film in that house.
You would have to reconstruct that.
Yeah, and
you would reconstruct it to maybe try to look that way, but like it wouldn't necessarily work. So
no.
Yeah, there will be some systematic decisions that they're making in order to function, but also just to like you said, like to play for a modern audience. So there might just be some generic mannerisms and social mores that during Regency time you would act this way.
Yes.
But the reaction would be that in Regency times. So what we need is that reaction.
Yes.
So if it's shock, we would not be shocked by a tiny handhold getting into a carriage, you know, but we are, because we know the context that little handhold really conveys.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So and obviously in the first episode where it's not like we're going to be able to give like let us give you a comprehensive list of like all the things that they changed or anything like that. It's just to try to set expectations. Not comprehensive. Comprehensive is not a word we can employ. But again, it's not about listing. It's not even about, I mean, we might give an example or two, but it's going to be primarily about setting expectations, right?
Yeah.
And in a sense, kind of setting aside, well, I don't want to say setting aside objections because that's not quite right. But again, like we don't want to have to waste time
explaining or rationalizing
every single time. Like every single time there's a departure to be like, now, of course, like here's once, you know, like we need to sort of discuss the situation, like the circumstances of the adaptations in this way. And I think that we can give, so like, for instance, even just comparing the two, I think it's fairly clear that that closer adherence to the historical period and atmosphere is more important to the BBC production than to the Keira Knightley one, right?
Yes.
That I think seems quite clear. And it's not that they're like flying by night in the Keira Knightley one, and that's not the point, but like they are clearly readier to depart from the from strict, you know, historical accuracy.
And I think probably in the primer too, because I'm immediately like, I know people are going to say, but they had more time in the BBC one, so they could do that.
That's another thing we need to discuss.
Yeah, I think we should discuss like different structures of adaptations too. Like, yes, one is a multi-hour, you know, mini-series, but there's still overarching decisions that were made, and I think adherence to Regency ways is one of the things that they chose.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
you know, that doesn't have to do anything with the time necessarily.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I'm already forgetting. What was the correct way to pronounce the Elizabeth Bennet actress in the BBC's name? That was a shock to me.
Jennifer, oh gosh, we did it again. Ailey? No,
Ailey? Ely. Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Somebody check us. I'm pretty sure it was Ely.
What I wouldn't ever have guessed. Yes, Ely. Jennifer Ely. So yes, it's when I just going back to that one example that I raised, right, of how Keira Knightley's Elizabeth Bennet throws Darcy's rude words that she overhears in his face. Mm-hmm. Jennifer Ely's Elizabeth Bennet would never do that. Like, again, like it's another way in which the kind of the proper behavior, the understanding, at least, like that film's understanding of the proper behavior of, you know, of social circles at that time, is more strict in that way. Like it would not, that wouldn't fly. That line would not fly in the BBC production. It just wouldn't fit there. So again, what that shows is we can see already some different decisions that are being made about, you know, the film, about the Keira Knightley film.
I mean, just the way we're talking about it, I'm putting it down here as a beat because I feel like that is just one of the clearest examples of a
It's a
change that makes
really clear.
a lot
I
of
mean,
sense.
when I, you know, watching the scenes that we're going to be talking about in episode 1, that was the one that, like, if I had hair, would have blown my hair back as far as like
Right.
shocking adaptation choices. Just thinking of the book. There are some other things that are interesting but subtle. That is
Now,
not subtle. That change.
just in terms of talking about that, though, I mean, how would we structure that? Because,
Though,
I mean,
hang on a second. I'm thinking that would be a useful illustration, not for episode 2, but for episode 1.
oh,
As a
okay. So to talk about context
talk
and
about
how,
context and
great,
adaptation and like,
good. Because I was like, wait.
yeah, yeah,
Okay.
no.
Okay.
Yeah, so if we can use that as a way to illustrate how,
Yep.
yes, to illustrate how the different sorts of choices. Yeah, as Gregory Simonson says, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Yes, exactly. Yeah, and
That's a
that's
great quote.
it is
Did
a
he
great
quote
quote.
that?
He's
That's
quoting
great.
somebody. I don't know whom he's quoting,
I like that.
but it is a foreign country. And again, it's yeah, your relationship with it when you're doing an adaptation or when you're doing a historical novel. But again, Austen was not writing a historical novel. She was writing a contemporary novel, which now
Right.
happens to be historical, right? So Jane Austen was writing a contemporary novel, and so she was not thinking about anachronisms and consistency to history. She was just writing the world around her. The BBC production is trying to reconstruct that historical period with, it seems, a good deal of accuracy. Karen Pollock thinks it's Robert Graves, that quote.
Okay.
But anyway, and then the oh no wait, it's L.P. Hartley. There we go. Phil found it.
Okay.
The Go-Between, a novel by L.P. Hartley. Anyway, so yeah. Anyhow, I think that it is. So you're right. We do also need to talk about. We need to talk about scope too. That's something we have to address because that's another classic example of something we're going to want to lay out on the table at the beginning, so
Yeah.
that we don't have to come back to it every single time we compare the BBC and the Keira Knightley and be like, no, of course, like they have 3 times as much screen time, in the BBC as they did the Keira Knightley one. Better just to address that from the start and address that again, not in the sense of like we're making excuses for them, like this is why their choices are worse because they don't.
Yeah.
No, it's like no, this is the context, and so therefore we need to understand their decisions in the context of the frame that they're filling, right? I mean, you can paint one thing within a frame that's this big, and you can paint something quite different in a frame that's that big, right? I mean, that's just how it works.
I'm thinking, you know how for Rings and Realms we had a disclaimer card come up before every episode,
Yeah.
basically saying like, here be spoilers, like
Right.
we're going to talk about stuff.
Right.
I kind of think we can do a little tongue in cheek. It would like we'd have to come up with probably 2 or 3 different titles to be like, here's our disclaimers.
Right.
But that's such a great way every episode to remind them of like what we're doing, who you and I are, our
Yeah.
tone. Like it
Yeah.
can be serious, we're going to be academic, but like it also is just such a great way to kind of establish like our vibe. So I feel like at the top of every episode we should just have a disclaimer and we can make it a little tongue in cheek. So we'll figure the title out for that, but stuff like that should be on that.
I like that.
Yeah.
So the issues. So I'm thinking of this in terms of like larger issues that provide like contextual issues for discussing these 3 works. The first, which is so obvious, but we have to say it, one of these 3 works is a book, and the other two are films. Like, we might as well start there, right? And
Let's start at the very beginning
and talk a little bit about that and what that means, right? And that's where I think we can do some illustrations from the book of, and actually we could do a little pre-gaming for the opening sequence, to be looking at, so for instance, how Jane Austen conveys, how she communicates to us information about the Bennet family, right? This is a large family. There's 7 people in this family, right? Mr. and Mrs. Bennet and the 5 girls. And we get information about all 5 of them in chapter 1. And right. It's quite short. So how does Jane Austen communicate that information to it and compare that to, but we're not going to be able to do all 7. So let's pick an example. Let's pick somebody like, I'm tempted to pick like Kitty or Mary, like one of the really, the most minor of all the characters in the Bennet family, and look at what, because that gives a smaller point of reference. Elizabeth is too big of a data point.
We're going to talk about Elizabeth a lot, so it's kind of nice to bring up one of the other ones.
Yeah. We could do, Lydia might be perhaps more advisable because she's going to be more important to the story later on.
Yeah, I'm like, Kitty doesn't read much to me, so I feel like Mary or Lydia.
We still get her though in chapter 1. Remember her coughing and her complaining about her not coughing for her own amusement, and then and then later, this is not in chapter 1, it's by the end of this sequence though, in chapter 3 I think, when Mr. Bennet is like, Kitty, you can cough as much as you like now, I imagine, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, we could. Lydia would be a kind of an obvious one, I think, to do a kind of a middle ground between the super marginal and, because she's a character which all of these 3 works are going to be. There's more invested in setting up Lydia for later on in the story, right? In the book and both of the films.
Do you want to take a look at her real quick and like actually talk through this example, or keep going through rough outline and then we come back and repopulate this?
Let's come back. Come back, because I'll get buried in this and we'll do nothing else. So let's take that as an example. Let's say maybe the Lydia example. So that's just as an illustration of like, how do they convey information differently? And again, the whole point here is this is like our primer. Right. This is, in order to provide context, this is the sort of thing that we're going to be seeing and that we need to understand. This is the kind of thing that we need not to take for granted, but we need to be fully informed by as we come to our analysis of these things. And of course, it's a major reason why. One of the things we're going to be looking at, like by necessity, because Lydia barely comes in. We get information on her in the book, but we get barely anything. Right. And so what we're going to see in the films is them adding stuff. Like they will have added a little, they both of the films add little Lydia sequences, which illustrate Lydia's character. Right. And so again, one of the things that we can point out here is, why do they add, like, why don't they just stick to the book? Why do they add things in films? This is a complaint people make about books all the time. Right? Why are they doing things differently? Why do they add that stuff? Well, look, this is one example of why why in a scene like they have to add stuff, because they can't just do it, and the medium is different. And in order to give us something, without it just being an audio book, they have to do it differently. So that's I think will be a pretty good illustration, and then we can do the world build. No, wait. Do we want to jump to the world building thing? Because the world building thing is complicated.
It is, but I was just trying to list like other things that we put under here. So don't worry about it being A, B, C, D, E. But like, 1 is book, 2 are films. How do we convey information differently? I think there's a really big list under that. So cherry picking what we cover is going to be pretty important. I do think world building fits in there, but
would you want to? I'm remembering when we did the opening sequence of Pride and Prejudice episode months ago. One of the things that you wanted to talk about a lot and were really struck by is the way that both of the film adaptations make large use of like big establishing shots, like the moving shots of the house and going through the house and everything. And we don't get anything like that exactly, but we do get something kind of parallel to it in the book in some sense. But what is parallel to it in the book exactly? How do you establish scene in the book compared to how they're establishing scene and setting in the films? That might be another different sort of, but really important, sort of structurally important illustration that we can give.
Yeah, because I feel like that's such a clear example, but I don't know if it's like important. And I mean that in a kind way, but like obviously it's important for us to talk about everything, but it's not as pivotal. It feels kind of like to me. Like,
right. What I'm wondering though is, so it's interesting because this one, here's why I'm interested in this question, is that how do you establish the setting? In the films, it's obvious, right? Those big establishing shots with beautiful music behind them is how they establish the setting, right? What's more complicated is what is the analog to that in the book? Like the book analysis there is the hard part, I think.
Yeah.
How does Jane Austen establish the setting? Because it's one thing to say, as I've been saying, oh, she's just writing a contemporary novel, so people will know. Yeah, well, people are familiar with lots of different kinds of houses and families and countrysides. You know, how does she establish their expectations for what this setting is? How is it that we know what kind of a house Longbourn is? What kind of a family the Bennets are? What kind of situation they're in? And she does all those things in the first chapter, but it is certainly, there is no direct analog to like the sweeping panoramic. She doesn't describe it. She does almost no description, almost no visual description at all in that first chapter.
And yet you absorb so much of what that world is based on the interactions. It is a really difficult one to explain with a show don't tell, and how you take that information on. So
I agree that the film analysis there is relatively simple, though points of comparison would be kind of interesting between the two of them. That is, they don't do it the same way in the two films. But the book analysis there is hard and interesting, I think.
But I think it's also really important to conversation of just like how we absorb information.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That's a really good example of like, let's talk about world building. It's a huge topic, but here's a really clear example of in a text, we are not told their house was 17 rooms and this it was this on the exterior and it had a vine growing down this and the light was coming this, like we didn't have script direction. We had a conversation between family members that painted a picture.
Yes.
And we were able to place that. But that's also like, you know, one of the challenges, right? Because we're all painting this picture in our brain of what the house looks like, and we're creating this world. So that's a big conversation in adaptation theory that I don't want to get into in this, but I think it's important to touch on, saying this is one of the things that people can get hung up on because we've created this world in our head. And that's really difficult sometimes when you then watch it on film and it's not the Bennett house to you.
Exactly.
Like that's not the Bennett house. Mine was blue, you know, and just how you kind of navigate that.
And it's another way, by the way, in which they were clearly very daring in the Keira Knightley version. Right. I mean, there are animals wandering into the house in Longbourn, right? Yeah. And that's like, it's their vision of what Longbourn is like, is quite different in that way. So yeah, they took a lot of risks of that kind, of like, that is not the Longbourn of my imagination kind. But I think it would be really fascinating to try to see in the book what is our imagination of Longbourn based on, in fact. Because it's one of the fascinating things about Jane Austen. Like, seriously, I have a hard time thinking of another author who spends less time on physical description of any kind
Anything.
than Austen does. She almost never describes anything. It's incredible.
I find that so fascinating though, because like if you told me that they weren't described in a certain way, I'd be like, nah, she has to. It's so clear. But it's so clear because of what we have gleaned from it and how we've seen that interpreted, not from Austen herself.
And
That's pretty
I
cool.
don't think she ever, like, what color is Kitty's hair? What color is Lydia's hair? Do we know? I don't think we know. I mean, we know that Elizabeth's eyes are dark. I'm pretty sure we know that Elizabeth's hair is dark and Jane is fair. But there is so little that I mean, even like, again, like the physical description of the people whose physical looks are talked about a lot, right?
Yeah.
We know Mr. Darcy is dark. And I think Bingley is fairer too. But do I know that? Absolutely know,
I know.
that?
I'm like,
I'm not
what?
sure.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can find some text.
We get
and-
some things like he was wearing a blue coat. We get that. Like, I know
Yeah.
the color of his coat and maybe of his boots. But anyway, it's really, yes, she is just a master at inviting us to imagine things. It's really, it's quite something. But anyway, yeah. Now, Phil, it is to some extent, it is true that Phil says how much of it would be because Lizzie and her sisters would be expected to dress in very particular ways, so there was no need to say. Yes, but this is the fascinating thing to me. Even when they are taking great care, like the characters themselves care a very great deal about how they look and what their dresses look like and things. We never get a description of the dresses. We'll get a description of shall I wear my muslin, for instance?
Yeah.
So like I'll know something about the style and fabric because she's told me it's a muslin. And doubtless if I were somebody more acquainted with the fashions of that time, I would have a very specific idea probably in my head of what that dress might have looked like. But even then, she doesn't even always tell us the color of the dress, right? Like it's, or even like, Lydia and Kitty will be fighting over ribbons, and we'll know that they're fighting over ribbons and that they're doing up their bonnets and stuff. But we won't even know like in what style, with what color. Like we're not told.
That's what's so fascinating though, because I feel like we live in such a visual language world now that we assume that will be described in a certain way, but it isn't, and we've filled in the gap. So
Yes.
I think actually pointing that stuff out and saying, what were they fighting about? Was it blue ribbons or cherries or
Right.
whatever?
Yeah.
And I'd be like,
Yellow
look what we
ribbons.
actually have.
Right.
This is what we actually have.
Here's the text.
And look at the battle that we have created on
Yes.
film for that.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So anyway, it is, but kind of pointing to this issue. This seems to me an episode 1 issue to point to. This kind of thing, and because it's another major illustration of the difference between book and film. And I think that because the problem is good authors are so good at this. The experience of reading a good book is that your own imagination is buoyed up and brought along, and you are filling in all of these things, and you're not even aware that you're doing it. And afterwards, you could swear that this picture that you have in your head that is so clear is exactly described in there, and it's not. It was your imagination the whole time, and that's why the book is so good. Like, that's what makes it so good. It is the opposite of a failing in the book that it should be so indistinct. But films, by definition, can't do it. They have to make every single one of these decisions. And therefore, there's always going to be that gap. And we need to acknowledge that. And we need to show how that's not just like, it's not an optional thing. It is a continuous and an inescapable element of doing a visual adaptation of a text. Sharon was asking if we're planning to review the behind-the-scenes extras offered in the films, because they provide a lot there about their adaptation choices. It would be
My gut
tempting.
is, yeah, my gut is yes, because, like any good researcher will be aware of all of the material at our disposal. But I'm also taking all of those with a grain of salt because any behind the scenes featurette is created to entertain as well as
Right.
inform an audience.
Yeah.
So for a behind the scenes featurette, sure, it's awesome to look behind, but I also think of those as potentially being really scripted and giving us their own version of events, and that's its own kind of
Right.
adaptation information. So
Right.
for me to go into that being like, wow, they're the biggest fans. They took care of this information so carefully. I remember with the James Cameron and Titanic stuff, them talking behind the scenes of like how maniacal he was about changing the paint color to make sure it actually matched the exact paint color of the Titanic. And
Right.
does that make me think about the film differently? Does that make me appreciate that scene more? Do I understand, I don't know, artistic endeavors more deeply because of his obsessiveness?
Yeah.
Behind the scenes are fascinating, but you also have to take them a little bit at face value and just be like, interesting. Let's just look at analysis. Interesting. Let's just look at analysis.
It's why I always feel the same way about author interviews and stuff
Yes.
like that. Like it's very interesting to hear what authors have to say about their own books and about their own process.
Hmm.
It impacts my reading of the book very little. And I frequently disagree with authors about their own books, and that's okay. Like it's fine. Like they, because again, they can say all they like. This is what I was going for, and I'm like, okay, that's great. That's very interesting to know. That doesn't mean you achieved it, and that doesn't mean that that's what's actually there, right? Uh, but so yeah, I mean, it's
But analysis is core to everything we're going to do.
yeah, the work analysis of the work itself is definitely the core.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Peripheral information, I think, is handy to reference sometimes
yeah,
because it does feed into the context and understanding. But our primary source is the text in the film.
yeah, yeah. Um, yes, our primary source is going to always be the text in the film. Okay,
Yeah.
so we give some illustrations of. Yeah, I really like leaning into this in the first episode. This prologue thing is a really good idea
Yes.
because it really does help us to kind of get out of the way a whole bunch of like to lay a bunch of framework so that it will free us up later. But it's
Also,
really
I think
important.
Also, if we did this with other things, if every year we did this with a different thing, this is still our first episode. Like,
Yeah,
it might be repetitive for some of the context to get people thinking about it, but we would use different examples for when
exactly.
that
We could go
is.
back and just do the similar thing with different examples.
Yeah.
We might not have to do it quite as much the second and third time, but yeah, we could illustrate the
Maybe, but
same thing.
like, yeah, maybe, but I think we still have to set the expectation that our audience is seeing this for the first time,
Right.
so we would
Right.
give the same information.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely.
Okay.
No, I love that. Okay.
Okay, we kind of already went straight into conveying
Outlining.
information. Right.
Yeah. Well, no, it's brainstorm. This is just I'm just brainstorming what we would want to do in a prologue episode, right?
Yeah.
We do
Yeah.
need to address the historical issue here, because one of the other important things, and this, by the way, is I think more important than people even think about when it comes to things like Tolkien adaptation, the historical gap
Hmm.
between when the book was written and when the films are being done, right? I mean, right now, like with Rings of Power, we're approaching 100 years later. I mean, the gap between Rings of Power and the writing of the Lord of the Rings, and especially some of the Silmarillion material that they're using, the other material, the other stuff that they're thinking about when they're working on the Rings of Power, the gap between that and between like us and between the BBC and Jane Austen, the BBC is only twice as far away from Jane Austen as the Rings of Power is from Tolkien's writings. Like it's kind of striking, actually.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we're approaching. we're what, 12 years away from the centennial of the publication of The Hobbit now.
Wow.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
Tolkien's books are old now.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is not to segue us into talking about Tolkien, but
No, but I think any of
it's
this,
relevant.
like, yeah, I mean, I kind of think of it in terms of like scientific experiment where like we're looking at all the factors.
Yeah,
Here's all the factors. So, and I'm also thinking visually because like we do want to produce this one a little bit differently. So in an introductory episode, we kind of do want like a bit of a whiteboard. So like here are our bullet points of
yeah,
like factual things that we are taking into consideration.
yeah,
And that's where I would also list things like budget, length of film, you know, production value, location limitations, like all that kind of stuff that
right.
can really affect how you perceive and observe stuff.
Yeah.
Okay,
And, but it also, again, like I said about the frame and the painting, right? It's not just that painting on a smaller piece of canvas that's going to go in a smaller frame restricts what you can paint,
Right.
but it's going to fundamentally change what you're going to try to paint,
Yeah.
right? You know, I mean, like that's just very often. I mean, not always. Like you can go to an art museum, right? And you can see a little like, you know, 1 foot by 2 foot portrait of a shipwreck, and you can see a 10 foot by 12 foot portrait of a shipwreck, right? So it's not like you can't do it all the same thing, you know, that you're forced into a completely different subject matter.
Yeah.
But again, like it's an important factor. And so again, to say something like the Keira Knightley film is much shorter in its scope, and also for a different audience too. I mean, like, let's not forget the BBC-ness of the BBC production as well, right? I mean, like,
Write that down. BBC-ness.
the like BBC productions are different from American films. Like,
Yeah.
they're just different. Like, they're for a different audience.
And in that era, I mean, the '90s BBC productions are real different than Sherlock and Doctor
Yes.
Who.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. So, so we do need to, and again, none of that, and I keep coming back to this because I feel like every time we talk about this, I feel like I'm making excuses. Like, oh, well, you know, we have to take into account these limitations and whatever. No, it's like,
No.
this is the occasion, right? They chose to do this adaptation. Like, they enthusiastically chose to do these adaptations and to do them in these particular ways, right? It is a 1990s BBC miniseries adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. That was the project. That was the thing. It was what was it, 2015? 2005? 2005. Yeah. It was a 2005, right, 15 years. That's where I got the 15 from. It was a 2005 American Hollywood film adaptation.
Theatrical release as well.
Sorry, what was that?
Theatrical release as
Theatrical
well.
release, yes. Theatrical release of, adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. Like, those are two totally, like, so they with their eyes open went into those two different situations, right? And therefore the frame that they were filling, right, the kind of project that they were doing, just as Jane Austen decided to write a novel and not a short story, right? She could have written a short story. She wrote the novel that she did. She could have written Clarissa. I don't know if you've ever read Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, one of the first English novels. It's like 900 pages long, and most modern readers find it the most stupendously boring book they've ever read. It's like basically like Clarissa sort of dying slowly of consumption for 900 pages. Anyway, it's as who was it? Samuel Johnson said anyone who read Clarissa for the plot would hang himself. But anyway, like,
What a review!
Yeah, yeah. No, he didn't hate the book, but he's saying like the plot is not what you read it for, right? But anyway, the point is, there were modes, right? There were modes of novel that you could write. And she was not writing like this, a long rambling. She was not writing Tom Jones. She was not writing Clarissa. She was not writing Vanity Fair. She was not writing, Bleak House. She was, there's lots of ways in which she could have written it, but she didn't, right? Her novel is short.
Yeah.
It's efficient. It's terse. That was her frame.
I love terse. That's such a great word. Yeah.
But it's not a short story either, right? It's a fully developed novel.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. But anyway, so that's and Karen is right. Karen she's tuning in from England. So she was saying that the BBC adaptation was an institution. She wants to sort of note the big expectations that accompanied the BBC adaptation. Like when the BBC undertook to do that miniseries, there was a lot of weight to that project. More weight, I think, much more weight, had to be than the theatrical release film in 2005 in America, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Jane Austen is quite popular in America, so it's not like there's no expectation. But seriously, like nobody was like, and now this landmark, film experience.
And also, I mean, maybe Karen can tell us because I wasn't here in 1995, but like I was here in 2003 and there were 5 channels and it like the country stopped when there was something new and good on
Right.
TV.
Right.
And like there's proven statistics about the commercial breaks in some of these series, the surge of power.
Right,
In
with
the UK
everybody
had to
putting
be
the kettle on.
protected 'cause everybody put their kettle on. In the
Yes.
commercial break, everybody put their kettle on to make a cup of tea, and they had to like protect the national grid because they knew that surge was coming. Like that's what BBC Pride and Prejudice did.
Right.
Like
Right.
I think, yeah, I don't know how much that would weigh into how I absorb things, but I do think it's an important like distinction in creation. Like people's motivations to create a story adaptation are different.
Yes.
This didn't have a streaming platform. This didn't have cult following. This was a core production, tight episodes, long in length, captivate a nation, get it done well,
Yeah.
Whereas you can't help but watch the Keira Knightley one and realize they're gunning for an Academy Award. This is all about cinematography. This score is incredible. This is so theatrical and Hollywood-esque. That doesn't mean any part of it is bad. It's just a
Right.
different motivation.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. They were.
And they're going to tell the story differently because they're focusing on those kinds of things as well.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely.
That also gets a little tricky because that's where I start to veer. This is what can be tricky about film analysis is it starts to veer pretty naturally towards opinion. So sticking very clearly with what we're actually seeing and what we can factually deduce from that.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's quite easy to be like, listen to the score. Clearly they want us to feel.
Right.
I don't.
And that gets very crit-ficky right away, where we're like
Yes.
making up a story about what the movie makers wanted and were hoping for. Which again, as we said, you can't even trust it when they tell you themselves what they were were trying and hoping for. And I don't mean trust in the sense that they're lying. I just mean that like your own narrative of a thing is
And your own frame of interpretation is different
exactly
from somebody else's.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like the number of things you and I have watched and have gotten totally different vibes from is the point.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So doing an acknowledgement of but this definitely seems this seems to be an important thing to acknowledge, even if we don't spend a lot of time discussing it. Just acknowledging there are different priorities. We don't have to claim that we know all of what the priorities are, right? But just to do a and by the way, like another element that we probably should like mention on the Jane Austen side is that although novels by women were not unknown, it was still not exactly, totally uncontroversial. So that what she's doing is a novel that was written by a woman and attested to be written by a woman, like not pretending to be written by a man. As was not uncommon, right? The Brontes tried that at first, right? George Eliot, obviously, right? Did the same thing, and Eliot was later. I mean, she was like 2 generations after Eliot, after Austen, almost. So Austen was quite new. Now there already were examples, female authors.
Yeah.
But so it's not like Jane Austen was like breaking totally new ground there. But it's an important thing to like she knew when she was writing that what she was doing was unusual, at least, and therefore that her reception would be uncertain.
Yeah.
So anyway, and I don't want to in any one of these three things, the film, the TV series, or the book, we could get into a whole like the history of those, of like the production history of each of the three works we're talking about is like its own show, right? And we can't get too deep in the weeds with any of those things, but just giving some context to remind people this is the frame, and here are some of the things that means, right? What does it mean that you have a novel, which is a novel, B, a contemporary novel, and C, a novel by a woman, about women. This goes back to the conversation we were having about why it's such a striking choice that Bingley and Darcy are the ones that bring in the BBC production, because one of the things that's very consistent in all of Jane Austen's novels is she sits down to write the female experience, and almost never even tries to describe what males do and say, what men do and say when women aren't there, because she doesn't know, she hasn't seen it, right? And so anyway, so just talking a little bit about what Pride and Prejudice is, and therefore how that impacts the storytelling. What the Pride and Prejudice, what the BBC series was, and what that meant, and how that informs some of the choices that they're making and the expectations that would have been on it, and how they're managing those expectations. That's actually, maybe expectations I think that might be a fun angle, because for all three we can talk about that. What expectations were there for you pick up a novel, it's 1810, you pick up a novel written by a woman, what are your expectations, right? And how is Austen managing those expectations? You sit down to a BBC miniseries adaptation of Pride and Prejudice in 1995. What do you expect?
You have a certain expectation, and like also thinking about like what came just before all of that. Like, I can't think off the top of my head, but like this was not the first BBC adaptation like this. So like there was already a preconception about what people are going to expect. Yeah. And the Keira Knightley one can't exist in a bubble either, because it's coming off of the BBC one. Right. Like there's no way that it's its own thing. Because
I mean, it's 10 years later. So yeah. Yes, absolutely. But it's not doing a miniseries. It's doing a theatrical release film. Yeah. Right. And so therefore, what are the expectations there? And how are they trying to manage the expectations, or even the things that they expect a theatrical audience is going to expect from a thing? And then we do need to talk about the historical stuff.
Yep. And I think that fits all right where it is. Yeah. Because we start with what we're doing, where we're doing it, general context, how do they convey information differently, and then moving into some specific examples. Here's our list of factual considerations. Yeah. Here's one we really want to take a look at. So we need to look at how information would be conveyed in a text, how an audience would receive that information from a text, and how that emotional exchange, that informational and emotional exchange, is conveyed on screen in different ways. Mm-hmm.
One example we could do is the character introduction one, like the Lydia character introduction is one illustration we could do of that. We should do a more significant one as well. How about the relationship between Elizabeth and her dad? Yep. That's very important in the story. All three stories try to convey that. we don't have to do like, we can focus in on a few very specific moments because it's just the element, like it's just the relationship that we're trying to focus on, not like what happens in a particular scene, or we're not exactly talking about information exactly. Ooh, Sharon's right. The Emma Thompson Sense and Sensibility would also have had a significant impact on the 2005 Pride and Prejudice as well.
So good.
Yeah. Yeah.
What year was that?
Hang on.
Yeah.
I know this one. That was like 96.
No.
Yeah. It was. I know it was because I took my wife to a date to see that in the theaters.
Oh.
And we borrowed my friend from college's car because mine was broken. And that, I'm pretty sure it was in
1995 film.
fall of 1995. Yeah, it would have been fall of night. It was senior year, so it would have been fall of 95. Yeah.
Which means they were in production at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a wholly wholly is in WH, not HO. Wholly British cast.
Mm-hmm.
Filmed at the same time, developed at the same time, one for theatrical release, one for BBC miniseries. That's kind of fascinating.
Yes. And the for different reasons and in different ways, the Keira Knightley production would have to do with both of those productions. Like both of those would be huge precursors.
I don't think there would be a ton for us to discuss between.
No, we can't get into detailed analysis of those. Yeah, but
no, not at all. But like, even if we were just doing Other Minds and Hands episode, I don't think there would be too much between the BBC Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility. Besides the fact that they happen at the same time, so they might be pitched to the same audience. Like that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But the Keira Knightley film coming after both of those would be pretty significant.
Yeah.
Okay, so thinking about what's around it. So BBC, what productions came before it and how that would affect audience perception. Same with Jane Austen, what texts did she put out before that would...
Yeah, her publication history is complicated because there's like the order in which she wrote them and then there's the order in which they came out.
Or even what contemporary texts were around her that would sow the seeds for this to be a successful text.
Yep. No, there's definitely.
So I'm going to put that up here with factual considerations. Context.
Because these sorts of things, that's all part of the expectations conversation.
Yeah.
Right? What are the expectations? Yep. Okay. So specific analysis points that we can do to illustrate some of this stuff. The Lydia introduction, Elizabeth's relationship with her dad, how that's conveyed.
Yeah.
And then we could talk about the specific example of how Lizzie handles the what she overhears at the ball, the first ball. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then that's where we talk about audience.
Yeah. Yep. Yep. Okay. That sounds like plenty for a first episode.
Sounds fun too.
It does. It does. So we have some points. We need to flesh it out a little bit.
Yeah.
As far as procedure, I guess, we'd probably both be on screen, or would we want to do different bits?
I don't know yet. I think it would depend how we break this down.
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine there'd be a fair bit more of us together on screen for the introduction episode.
Yeah.
And just kind of talking through each of these points, but maybe it's like cut to Maggie or
right.
when we record in Zoom, does it record the video separately? Are we going to be able to cut to a large one of you while you're explaining something and a large one of me when I'm explaining something? Or is it always going to be this split?
I think we can, I mean, we can do like speaker view, basically.
Okay.
It'll do multiple recordings in that way. We could do a speaker view version
Speaker
where
view.
it would do.
We won't be able to share our screen, so we'll have to have,
Yeah, that's
which is
fine.
fine. It's,
We,
yeah, it's
we
just
don't
planning.
want to really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's just planning. And for folks watching along live, we can always be like, here are the documents that you need to have in front of you, a PDF of Pride and Prejudice.
Right. Right.
Because we'll edit that stuff in later.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Okay. And so next time, let's try to work out a good. We'll do a full script of this.
Yep.
Full script in sense of bullet points, and we'll have to include things like timestamps and stuff for what we want to discuss, and page numbers and timestamps to get all of our passages laid out.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we could, so I could see us doing one more episode where we do all of our final scripting and we're getting everything set. Really appreciate people's suggestions and ideas here as we've been talking about this. So looking forward to your script suggestions as well as we work that out, and then we'll see about recording it.
Yeah, especially for this first episode, the introductory stuff, we might even be able to do a little bit of a dry run next week.
Yeah.
Depending on how much we can flesh out, because it'd be quite nice to just kind of jump straight into that, and then we would do another planning episode for episode 2.
Yes.
Which would be the textual analysis specifically of this stuff.
Yeah.
Cool. It's shaping up.
Good.
Yeah. Thanks, folks.
Excellent. Yeah. Strong work, everybody. That was good. That was good.
Team effort. I also feel like you probably need this background.
Oh, okay.
I probably need to make the film background.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that. Well, you got films and books in there too.
Oh yeah.
I could do a Pride and Prejudice background.
Okay. Maybe we just want to keep it simple because we are going to have so much overlay and cut to other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Think about backgrounds.
I will.
We'll see.
I will.
Okay.
Maybe I can just find like a Regency parlor background to sit in.
I was like, maybe, like, was William Morris, is that the right era? Like, can we just have like a really beautiful...
It's a little later, but he's later than this, but
or we just see if there's like some sort of 3D visual of our favorite background from one of the films, like this is Netherfield House behind me, or this is Pemberley.
Yeah. Okay. That'll be good.
We'll have some options we can float with everybody next week.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Very good.
Great. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. And we will look forward to continuing next. I should be around next week. Next week should be good. I'm going to be away the next Monday, which is Monday, like the 14th, I think.
14th.
Yeah, I'll be away on the 14th, but I'll be here next week on the 7th. And then I should be back on the 21st.
I think I'm good for all of July. I am not around the 4th of August. Other than that, I think I'm
not either, actually, so that's fine.
Great.
Yeah.
Bonus.
Yeah.
Okay, so on for next week.
I'll be doing college visits that weekend.
What?
With Matthias, yeah. Yep, a little college tour that weekend.
Exciting.
And into the next week. So, anyhow, there we are.
Thanks,
all right.
guys.
Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you guys
care.
next week. Bye now.